What do you think about the economic impacts of the climate change, and what is your assessment of Sri Lanka readiness to it?
Sri Lanka, we think the impact of climate change, I mean, as I said earlier, that it's manifesting itself through more variability in the weather. When we look at the impact of climate-related disasters, and we see that the impact is projected to increase over time. So it's definitely it's important to manage those risks and to be well prepared.
When you're making fiscal policies and other financial documents, do you consider climate change as a main concern?
So as the World Bank, we put climate change at the forefront of a lot of the work we do. We do look at what will be the impact. Often we try to see to what extent the impact, if there's an impact, how we can mitigate it or minimize the impact. In some cases, we design a project to have a certain contingent funding, so that if there's any climate-related disaster, it would actually allow us to disburse against it. So to disburse more quickly out of the project. So one way to look at it is when there's an emergency. Sometimes the World Bank has funds available, but they are locked up in certain projects. So in the design of our project, we have a so-called zero component where these funds can be quickly reallocated to help the country deal with the impact if that's if there's an urgent need for it. So that's several ways in which we, at the project level, try to take environmental risks into account. That's apart from projects we do that actually target environmental risk. For example, in Sri Lanka we have a wetlands project about the preservation of the urban wetlands and the biodiversity, but also we have disaster with risks if they occur.
The nationally determined contributions, those NDCs, it's an important element in addressing climate change. What are the aspects the World Bank as an economist, when you are making all these projects, preparing the projects, what are the concerns? I mean,
at this stage, I don't think we have yet tried to align ourselves exactly with the NDCs. I mean, we are aware of what Sri Lanka is trying to achieve, and we think there are ways to do it. So we focus mainly on, say, greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, another option would be to introduce a carbon tax, which would directly try to increase the tax on the most polluting greenhouse gases. That would be another way to help the country target those greenhouse gas emissions reductions that the country has committed itself to compared to a business-as-usual scenario under these NDCs. And it's important when you do think about carbon taxes to design them well. At the moment, you already have a form of taxation on petrol. Imported petrol and diesel is taxed both as a customs duty, PAL, and as excise. But these excises don't seem to be calibrated to target the most polluting forms of gases, but also the most polluting industries. So when you design a carbon tax, also important to take into account which end users will be affected most, whether it's industries or certain households. We know from our analysis and the data that's collected by the Department of Census and Statistics who consumes what and how much. And based on that, you can actually try to design a carbon tax that that changes behavior to maximum extent, so that your greenhouse gas emissions will drop by the amount that Sri Lanka committed itself to. At the same time, has the least impact on industries, and it means also helping industries to change the energy mix. For example, through improving the business environment to make it easier for them to get the financing and the requirement to change their mix, but also to look at which households will be most affected by carbon tax, and make sure that the poorest households, the most vulnerable ones, are compensated. In principle, it should not be too hard, we think, because first of all, the energy excise that's in place seems to be benefiting mostly the non-poor, because they're the largest users of energy, and they get therefore the fixed domestic price, retail price, below the global market price. Basically, it means that the non-poor get the most out of the energy, out of these policies. And if you have a carbon tax, then some of the fiscal savings can be used to compensate the poorest households. So there is, with proper design, you can actually try to put into place policies that actually have a positive environmental impact, but also minimizes the social impact.
Risk assessment is important when addressing development in a country. How are countries concerned about the risk assessment when they are planning and making their proposals?
I've been here for 2.5 years, and Sri Lanka has been seen 2 floods, landslides, and a drought. And it's important, knowing that these recur, and knowing that there's actually, you can estimate more or less the probability and the cost of it. You can be try to have a layered approach to the risks. For example, certain disasters are very high impact, but relatively low frequency, and there are disasters that are very high frequency but relatively low impact. And you may have different financing strategies for those. For example, for high frequency, relatively low impact disasters, you can have a space in the budget. So you have a budget line item which can quickly disburse funds immediately after the disaster strikes, so both in terms of reconstruction and social protection. For larger ones, which threaten to throw the country's kind of fiscal policy path off track. For example, if you look at the floods that happened in 2016, it had an impact on both the revenue, because the import duties were lowered on certain essential goods to come in, but also an impact on expenditure, because reconstruction expenditure and relief, the impact on imports and exports. So given that a large disaster has the ability to have a macroeconomic impact, you may want to have also a form of insurance that's outside the country, for example, whether it's a credit line or an insurance policy, so you can get the funds for outside the country quickly to make sure that it strengthens your balance of payments, but also allows you to spend the money without, at that specific point, having to adjust your fiscal balance immediately. So that's what we call a kind of a layered approach, whether you do it for your own budget for small amounts or having an external credit facility for large disasters.
So thank you very much, Ralph, for joining with us.